Hey, it's Mazzy. This is It's the Music Stupid, a series of videos I do. Number 42. This is where I pull some records and just show them my collection, kind of overview of 5 albums that I've been listening to lately. Now, these actually connected, at least in my mind, because of the political nature of the artists and the records. Now, it's not a video on pure politics. But if you're a little, you got dainty feelings and you can't handle a little politics and music, maybe you should just move on about this. I'm not going to hear and spout my political opinions. It's about the music and these artists here in particular. I'm going to start off with an album from 1954, and this is Odetta. This is Odetta and Larry. Sounds like a kind of a comedy team, doesn't it? But it's anything but. Now, Odetta became a huge activist in the civil rights movement, but a folk singer. And the essence of folk music from the 1950s and the 60s, especially in America, more so than folk music and the folk revival in the UK. I think there was more of a traditional sense for the most part in the United Kingdom, folk music of this period. But in the United States, it became very political, very social. Some would say socialist. Folk artists were put in that category, which was not always true. But there was a certain social direction of their music in some cases. Now, this is not a overt political record. This record is the first record by Odetta and Larry Moore. Larry Moore was a folk singer and banjo player. And what's really interesting about this is Odetta was in New York and went on a touring group of a theatrical play of the musical Finian's Rainbow. A little bit later become a motion picture later in the 60s. But she stops in San Francisco and she ends up staying in San Francisco for a while. San Francisco and New York especially were two big hubs in the folk music scene, the beat poets obviously in San Francisco, what was happening with beat poets with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg and City Lights Books and everything. And in North Beach was the hub of the folk music scene with a bunch of clubs, obviously, that predate me in terms of I was way, way too young to attend these places. They're long gone by the time I was into this music. But this record came out in September 1954, literally weeks after I was born in San Francisco, across town on the edge of the Haight-Ashbury. She was playing at a club in San Francisco called the Tin Angel, as was Larry Moore, and they got together and started playing. And the two owners of Fantasy Records from Berkeley, came over and heard them and signed them and wanted to do this record. Now, this is sort of traditional folk music of the day. This is a beautiful record. Some of it was recorded live at the Tin Angel, not the entire set, but a lot of folk standards of the day. You have John Henry, you have Old Cotton Fields at Home, of course. Those of you of a younger generation, my generation, younger compared to this generation, got to know that song a lot because of Creedence Clearwater Revival. But of course, Harry Belafonte was someone that really championed Odetta as well. Run, Come See Jerusalem. Odetta had a spiritual side to her. She was, but again, got very entrenched in the civil rights movement, and all her records later on, I believe on Vanguard, were just amazing records. One of her records at Carnegie Hall later, she's this young black woman who plays Carnegie Hall. Just a wonderful, important folk artist. Influenced, and was a artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, and a lot of the singers in there obviously played, again, was a supporter and involved in the civil rights movement in terms of Martin Luther King and Harry Belafonte, and that period in the mid to late 60s. This is a 1970s reissue on Fantasy Records. I believe this first came out as a 10-inch by Fantasy, and there's any version of this you get. It's really beautifully recorded, beautifully sung by the both of them. But anytime I see an Odetta record, I pick it up. Next, I have to show We Insist. This is a 1960 album. This is probably the first overtly political jazz album. And this is Max Roach's Freedom Now Suite with lyrics by Oscar Brown. Of course, Max Roach is a great jazz drummer. On here you have wonderful percussion by Olatunji. You have one track with Coleman Hawkins. And of course you have the great the powerful vocals of Abbey Lincoln on some of this track. Now, this is an out there record. This is an avant-garde record. This at times is a challenging record, but this is a beautifully intense record. And I think it's a record that anyone with a really deep jazz collection should have a representative. This came out on Candid Records in 1960. This was a reaction to the civil rights movement, the beginning of the sit-ins by African Americans on college campuses starting in I think it's Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. And Max Roach obviously took note. Jazz artists were pretty apolitical up to this point, but this changed everything. And into the 60s, obviously, a lot of jazz artists, as well as aforementioned folk artists, later rock artists, really intertwined and add politics. This is overt. This is an intense album at times. It's a very percussive album, obviously coming from drummer Max Roach, and with Olatunji mixed in, you get this kind of African vibe throughout some of it. I mean, songs like Driving Man, Freedom Day, Triptych. Now, Triptych, Prayer, Protest, Peace, really goes off with Abbey Lincoln. Now, I know she starts out on Driving Man, her vocals, and are just, she's not unlike an Odetta with her overt political stance and social output during the 1960s. And a couple of years later, Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln would get married. I think they were married for 7 or 8 or 9 years or so. But there's an intensity in her voice on this album. In fact, towards the end of side 1, which may be a turnoff to some people, you could see Yoko Ono getting influence to that part of this record. I'm sure she has it. She was in New York during that time when she got into the Fluxus movement and the avant-garde, and I'm sure this record crossed over in those artists in the 1960s. Definitely an important record. Came out on Candid Records originally. This is a recent Candid issue, a reissue that came out. Anytime, I highly recommend you get this album. Freedom Now Suite, again, Abbey Lincoln, Coleman Hawkins, Olatunji. This is produced by Nat Hentoff, who actually wrote the liner notes, who was a jazz and folk critic at the time. So this is such an important record. You could totally see John Lennon and Yoko get influence this and this with their Sometime in New York City. Not musically, but just that in-your-face political thing. But this is a wonderful, wonderful record. I totally understand why some people don't want to mix these kind of videos or music with politics, but politics has been an important part of music, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's country, folk, jazz, especially since the 1960s. But probably the most overtly political folk artist in the 1960s, which always didn't serve him well commercially, but I think one of the wonderful voices vocally, not in just how his voice sounded, but what he wrote about, is Phil Ochs. And this is his second album, I Ain't Marching Anymore. This is from 1965. This is a protest album for the most part. He has songs on here. I love how in this record, in the liner notes, it's on Elektra Records, produced by Jacques Holtzman, who was the founder of Elektra Records, primarily a folk record until later in the 60s when they really dived into rock and roll with the Doors and Love and Iggy and Stooges, Iggy Pop, the Stooges, definitely. But this record really means it. When Dylan, did some protests and social songs, Dylan obviously started getting away from that. And there's always this famous rivalry of Phil Ochs and Bob Dylan, but this is a pure folk record and somewhat of a pure folk protest record. This is Phil Ochs with a guitar only, just him and the guitar alone, and that's what makes it even more powerful. His liner notes here, he goes through track by track. This starts out with probably what's become his most famous track, his most famous political track, definitely. Protest song, I Ain't Marching Anymore. And he talks about the borders between pacifism and treason, combining the best qualities of both. The fact that you won't be hearing this song over the radio is more than enough to justify for the writing of it. I mean, he knew his place. He knew that he wasn't going to get a lot of love on the radio with his music. You know, maybe by the time the underground FM radio started happening, this music in a way was considered passe. Maybe they'd play Vietnam Talking Blues by Tom Paxton that had a sort of sense of humor, a marriage of Vietnam War stories with pot smoking. But this guy was the real deal. Again, that rivalry with him and Dylan, he kept political, and he kept, unfortunately, had a tumultuous ride in his life. Did some amazing records. Pleasures for the Harbor is one of my all-time favorite records. Very not political for the most part, except for one track, social track, outside of a small circle of friends, not in an anti-war stance, but a beautiful record. I love that record, but that's a whole different thing. This is a folkster with acoustic guitar in New York City in the 1960s. He does have a certain poetic side on this record as well. He does a song called the end of side one called The Highwayman, and it's based on a Alfred Noyes poem that he writes. He writes, I could never follow poetry in school, but this work by Alfred Noyes has completely captivated me since my childhood. It's a classic study of romantic narrative that seems to have been made for music. So he wrote music to this song. So there is a certain beauty in his writing, in his voice, and his arrangement here. So it's not all in-your-face politics, but it is there. So Phil Ochs, his second album, I Ain't Marching Anymore, from 1965 on Elektra Records. Again, can't talk politics without talking about Billy Bragg. I mean, I've been a fan of Billy Bragg since his first album. This is his third LP from 1986, Talking with the Tax Man About Poetry. The difficult third album. He's a punk poet. He is a punk folk artist. His first two records are just basically him and his Telecaster guitar. I saw him open up for Echo and the Bunnymen, I'm thinking 81, 82-ish, and I had no idea who he was. And he opened up, walks out with his little amp, his guitar, and the audience was somewhat rowdy, and he quieted them down. He is just forceful. He is one of those, again, not unlike Phil Ochs. In fact, Phil Ochs is a very big influence on Billy Bragg, as is Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan, of course, all those folk artists. He really wears his politics on his sleeve for a lot of people. Turns on a lot of people, turns off a lot of people. I get that. This is that difficult third album where he comes from doing just him and his guitar to a more rounded band and players on here. You have Johnny Marr on guitar on here. You have Kirsty MacColl on some vocals on here. This was co-produced by Kenny Jones and John Porter. Of course, John Porter would produce almost all and many of the Roxy Music albums. I think he came in on the third Roxy album, as well as Brian Ferry record. So it's got a little more polished thing, but it's not a slick album by any stretch. In fact, this is a wonderful record, and it might be a good place for someone to start. Later, he gets more romantic in his songs, but even here, the song on here called The Marriage is a wonderful song, and The Passion. But Greetings to the New Brunette is probably one of his signature songs around this time too. Ideology, Help Save the Youth of America, The Home Front. Obviously he's got his politics, his socialist stances in some cases, but a very British album, always for unions, the working class, and a powerful artist in my book. And anything Billy Bragg does, I'm all in on. His beauty, the poetry of his romanticism, aligned with his wonderful political diatribes, but beautifully done. I've seen him maybe 6, 7 times over the years since that first trip. I've seen him, in clubs. Just to me, a spectacular artist. And Billy Bragg, someone who's very consistent with his politics and very consistent with his music. And he's someone, sometimes to his detriment, who has put people off because of the politics. And I know people in the UK, he's one of those artists that they love him or they can't stand him. And I can understand that. But I am all in on Billy Bragg. And I admire the guy. Of course, he did those great 3 records with Wilco where the estate of Woody Guthrie gave him the lyrics, and him and Wilco made those 3 albums, the Mermaid Avenue albums. Just wonderful music. And then the last album today is the debut by The Clash. I mean, I want to say it again. Every record I keep showing here today, I keep saying you can't talk about politics and music without talking about The Clash. Now, there are plenty of other artists that when I do the 5, I have to narrow it down to 5. And these aren't necessarily my all-time 5 favorite political albums. There are so many, even the big bands that you like, the Stones, Street Fighting Man, the Beatles, Revolution, countless others. I really admire when an artist speaks his truth. Whether I agree or not, I tend to agree on most of these sides of the coin. But there's, political bursts that I don't care for in music. Sometimes I can separate it. Sometimes you guys can separate it. Some of you can't, and I understand that. This is my original copy. This is the UK version of this debut Clash album. This came out in 1977. This was different than the American version. The American version, which I no longer have. I think I have a CD set with the American on it. 5 songs different. Some people like the American better, sometimes like this better. The American had some of their singles, including their wonderful cover of I Fought the Law, and the Law one, I believe that's on there. So both are important. And I don't know if there's a CD that has all the tracks, probably, and I probably even have it. But I just think this is an amazing album. Now, of course, what's great about this, obviously, you got Janie Jones opens up Remote Control. I'm So Bored with the USA. An incredible song, and I understand what they were talking about at the time in 1977. That whole promotion, in a way, The Clash, the only band that matters. Remember, 1977, the Stones were the heads of rock and roll, or was it the Stones became the greatest rock and roll band in 1970 by default? The Beatles split up. The Stones, of course, some will say the Beatles weren't a rock and roll band like the Stones, but the Clash definitely was her. And I think, when 77 hit, where you talk about the Stones and you talk about what in 78, Miss You and their disco side, I like that Stones, but this was the band, the only band that mattered in 1977, 78, even up through, I think their most commercial album, accessible album to most, is London Calling, which is a great record. I like all their records. Cut the Crap, is that when they went the trio? It's okay, but this album, it's not as overtly in your face as I recall. I played it again the other night. Of course, I've heard it many times for years, but it's got a strength to it. Of course, I'm So Bored in the USA, as I said, White Riot, London's Burning, Career Opportunities. That was one of my favorite songs here about, the working class and people on the dole in the UK at the time of this record, and in England, definitely. Austerity. And I also did love the version, was it on their, on Sandinista, I think, with the little kid doing the orchestration version. Was that on that album? I think. I'm blanking out right now. I think that's the album it was on. Garageland, Protex Blue is a fantastic song. I don't think that is on the American version, but every song in this is great. Of course, this is a time when what's great about it too is these British bands, especially the punk bands, would mix some reggae in here. And I always said the British bands got away with mixing in reggae, unlike the American bands. When the American bands, try to do reggae up a song, and do the reggae beat, usually it fell flat and it seemed contrived. But the Brits, the punk Brits, got away with it and did it really well. They were living it, in the UK at the time, with all the immigrants from Jamaica coming and what was happening during that time. in reggae music and what was happening in the UK. You know, reggae was much more popular in the UK way before America. I mean, I remember the first reggae single I ever heard and bought, and I didn't even know it was called reggae, was it 67 or 68? I guess 67. The Israelites by Desmond Decker. Wonderful song, great hit. But I don't remember them calling it out as reggae back then, but at least not in America. But this is a powerful album. This is a wonderful album where the Sex Pistols were, you know, fun. That they burned brightly on that one record. They seemed to me, you know, as much as a protest record that was, and it was, of course, against EMI, the fascist regime. You know, God Save the Queen. They seem more contrived, even though there was reality in their lyrics too. But this was the real deal. You know, you could compare them to a later day Rolling Stones when the Stones were young and angry. But even the Stones weren't as young and angry ever as the Clash were. But I followed the Clash for many years, saw them 3 times in San Francisco. Just a fantastic band and a fantastic record. Strummer and Jones, all the songwriting on here. What a great team. And it was unfortunate when Mick Jones left the band, because I like that mix of their vocals, very different vocals. So the Clash. So that's my 5 in the pocket, politically pocketed records for It's the Music Stupid. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Mazzy loves you. Peace in the world, literally. We need that more than anything else right now.